thank you so much for the kind words. Thank you, obviously, to BERA members, and most of all, thank you to all of you for being here to hear what I've got to say. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into the paper that I've prepared, and hopefully there'll be things of interest in it for you. By the way, I'm talking about education. Hope that's not too much of a surprise. Education has been a feature of human development for many thousands of years, enacted in informal ways through human interaction and increasingly over time formally organised ways. Both informal and formal educational processes, practice and theory contribute to the way that education has developed, ultimately as an academic discipline in universities. My presentation today focuses on the nature of education as a vital part of human knowledge. In particular, I argue that education is a coherent academic discipline that shares key characteristics with other disciplines established much earlier in history in some cases. I've organised the talk into 5 parts. First of all, I'm going to take a very broad sweep of history, beginning, 320,000 years ago. Then I'm going to say some words about theorising education, building on work of respected colleagues, and in particular, I frame the talk around 3 clusters of knowledge traditions: academic knowledge traditions, practical knowledge traditions, and integrated knowledge traditions. And I'll explain more as I go through. Then, in my 3rd section, I move to comparing education with other disciplines. I include in this a short analysis of some of the ref reports for different subjects. And I then move on to the place of educational practice in relation to education research. And not surprisingly, for some of you who know me, I'm going to say a few words about the BERA Close to Practice research project that I was involved with. And all of this will lead me to my final section, where I talk about education and its contribution to knowledge going forward from today onwards. Now, my approach to this is, I'm looking at the contribution of education to human knowledge, so that's intentionally broad. And while I have great respect for more tightly focused scholarship, which incrementally adds to knowledge, I also think it's important to consider the breadth of human existence in relation to education. So, the talk accommodates a long history of human activity and takes a multidisciplinary perspective. Consideration of broader landscapes of thinking is an important way, in my view, to extend knowledge, and is an approach that's seen attention in other disciplines. To finish the talk, I'm going to suggest a layered continuum as a model to reflect the nature of education as a discipline. I also conclude that greater confidence in the multidisciplinary features of education, coupled with a more confident, outward-facing portrayal of education research, is needed. And so to my first section, education in history. If education is defined as a planned act by at least 2 people to use human language to share understanding of a phenomenon, then it's reasonable to argue that education first began 320,000 years ago. Scientific evidence from DNA analyses, corroborated by evidence from fossils, shows that the most recent shared ancestor of all present-day humans lived about 320,000 years ago. And the DNA evidence also reveals that although all modern humans originate from Africa, the story is much more complicated than previously imagined. As David Reich says, in the last few years, the genome revolution, turbocharged by ancient DNA, has revealed that human populations are related to each other in ways that no one expected. The story that is emerging differs from the one we learned as children or from popular culture. It's full of surprises, massive mixtures of differentiated populations, sweeping population replacements and expansions, as population differences that exist today. It's a story about how our interconnected human family was formed in myriad ways never imagined. Now, in spite of these important advances in DNA science, Reich likens the level of our understanding of the human genome to the level of development of a young child learning to read. So although genetic scientists have learned to decode the proteins that represent DNA, i.e. the words, they still can't parse the sentences. One of the few areas of DNA science where there's a relatively clear picture is the genetic mutation that resulted in the evolution of human language and hence differentiated us from other animals. The evidence lies in the proteins of the gene called FOXP2, which is strongly suspected to be related to language. And whereas the protein produced by the FOXP2 gene has remained identical in mice and chimpanzees over a 200,000-year period, 3 changes or mutations occurred only in the human lineage. Corroborative evidence has been found in the different squeaks made by mice if the FOXP2 gene is manipulated. However, the question of precisely when and how oral language started is difficult to answer, not least because the only historical sources are indirect ones, such as the study of the anatomy of the jaw in skeletal remains and indeed in the study of DNA. So the scope of Wright's attention to human development, for example in his book A Big History of Everything, is matched by the work of David Christian, a historian who's addressed human development on a vast scale. From David Christian's perspective, the uniqueness of human language is similarly recognised, and crucially for my argument today, humans' capacity for teaching, or what I would call education. Christian makes a clear distinction between humans and other animals on the basis of education. And as you can see here, he says, no animal can swap stories about the future of the past or warn about the lion pride 10 miles to the north or tell you about gods or demons. They may be able to think about such things, but they cannot talk about them. And that may be why it's hard to find any evidence for teaching within any other species, even among our closest relatives, the monkeys and apes. Now, of course, humans' use of language was at first only oral language, but another key historical milestone in relation to education, and an important source of historical evidence more generally, lies in the development of the written language, another facet unique to human animals and their cognition. Historically, the origins of writing lie in cave art. The figurative depiction of an animal, a babirusa or pig deer, and a handprint is the earliest example of human mark making currently known. This is what it looked like in the paper that I read, and then they also helpfully provided an enhanced version. These images were created about 40,000 years ago in a cave on the island of Sulawesi in Wallacea, a zone of oceanic islands between continental Asia and Australia. The first alphabetic signs did not appear until many thousands of years later, between 2000 and 1500 before the Common Era. It's possible to date some of the first teaching of writing to this same period around the development of alphabetic scripts. And this slide shows an unfired clay tablet inscribed with the written script Cuneiform. It was found in Mesopotamia, that's modern-day Iraq, and the cuneiform characters were practiced by imprinting the clay tablet using the end of a piece of reed. Excavations have produced hundreds of what we can call school exercise tablets from the period. Advanced students copied more elaborate texts, others practiced the cuneiform equivalents of ABC lettering. Now, not only are the tablets evidence of pedagogy and education, in my view, but have noticed the fact that the decipherment of cuneiform was begun by a high school teacher, the German Georg Grotefend, who's lived from 1775 to 1853. So written language not only enabled humans to communicate over greater distance and indeed create the concept of history as a phenomenon and practical reality, but written language was the essential component in the formation of systematic human thinking and rationality, as David Olson has argued in his book, The Mind on Paper. Now, in addition to the deep thinking about practice done by teachers in classrooms, whether that's back in history or today, another important aspect is not just the practice, it's the theories that these educators have. So jumping forward rapidly now to the 16th century, we find some of the first educational theories. This was boosted by the print. For the first time, we could print books in English, for example. Now, this is one of the most famous printed popular accounts of educational theory in the English language. was published in 1582 and written by the headmaster of Merchant Taylors' School in London. Richard Mulcaster's Elementary, or titled in full, as you can see maybe, the first part of the Elementary, which entreateth chiefly of the writing of our English tongue, set forth by Richard Mulcaster. Mulcaster said that the purpose of the Elementary was to inform teachers working in elementary schools to help young children learn on the basis of educational principles. Not only did the book advance Mulcaster's theory of education, perhaps the first systematic theory of primary education ever written, but it was also significant because of its role in the acceleration of the standardization of written English in line with the historical development of printing. And Mulcaster argued that the principles that he laid out in the Elementary needed to be warranted, and I quote, by general authority of all the greatest writers. He reminded readers that Plato stressed the importance of gymnastic for the body and music for the mind. He noted that music was considered much more important in Plato's time than Mulcaster perceived it to be in the school curriculum of the 16th century. Other ancient writers were also cited in the Elementary, for example, Pampilus's views on drawing as part of liberal science, Quintilian's mastery of rhetoric in support of reading, writing and music. Mulcaster's appeal to philosophy then was an early example of multidisciplinary thinking in education. As the good academic I am going to do some defining of my terms. I love the Oxford English Dictionary. That's perhaps a private love, but anyway, I always think it's a good starting point. How does it define education? The process of bringing up a child with reference to forming character, shaping manners, behaviour, etc., the manner in which a person has been brought up. Now, and the Oxford English Dictionary, of course, is not just definitions. They provide examples for all of these things. So I tracked down this example as the way, they give examples of how the word is used in context or in a context. There are, of course, multiple definitions of many words. So the other one that I'm going to share with you, I suppose if the first definition is related to more informal forms of education, you can see that this one is much more related perhaps to our key interests here today. The systematic instruction, teaching or training in various academic and non-academic subjects given to be or received by a child, typically at school. And then this last bit I think is important, the course of scholastic instruction a person receives in his or her lifetime. So that's, for me, that's suitably broad and it needs to be. And then the example given is from quite a long time ago, 2009. This was the Independent Newspapers online version, and this is the example here of the use of the word education. I suppose my observation quickly about that is, what do we see? But, well, politicians have this recurrent obsession that technology is going to solve all our educational problems, but then they often fail to realise that pedagogy is the issue, not just the technology. But that would take me off into a whole other talk. So, the English word then, education, it has etymons from Latin and French. In classical Latin, it meant rearing, upbringing and nurture. In the period of Middle French, it referred to bringing up a child, in particular their physical, mental and spiritual development. This was about 1380, but was rare really before 1527. In Spanish, 1499, the word emerged. Portuguese, 17th century. Italian, 1498. So for me, why am I saying this? Well, because the language and the words is another historical clue to help me anyway think about education and think about all sorts of things. So my reflections on some key moments so far bring me to the point in time when universities were established. These, of course, places where belatedly education was to be represented as an academic discipline. The oldest university in the world is regarded as the one established in Fez, Morocco, in the 8th century. But the origin of the modern university as a formal institution, that's one that continuously operates from its establishment and has a corporate structure, is said to be the University of Bologna, probably in about 1088, and then the University of Oxford in 1167. And right from its inception, the University of Bologna had multidisciplinary roots. At the end of the 11th century, the scholars of grammar, rhetoric and logic applied themselves to the study of law because a controversy arose in relation to the laws of the empire compared to the laws of other political bodies. 4 scholars ruled, on the basis of Roman law, that the laws of the empire were preferable, and as a result, the empire undertook to protect scholars from the intrusion of all political authorities. The concept of academic freedom was born. The roots of the academic discipline of education in universities can be traced as well to the training or education of teachers. In Europe, the first École Normale for the training of teachers was established at the end of the 17th century in Reims. Around the same time in Germany, the first Lehrerseminar, training seminars, were established. And in England, teacher training began in 1798 in Southwark, London. And it's been suggested, by the way, that the low socioeconomic status of many families in Southwark at the time was a factor in the perceived lack of credibility for education as a discipline in universities, compared to subjects such as medicine or law, which had claims to a longer university tradition of academic excellence or credibility built on their elite beginnings. And finally, in the 20th century, education began to be recognised formally as an academic discipline in nearly all universities. A discipline is defined not only as an area of knowledge, but also as a community of scholars with a shared heritage, as actually Gary McCulloch, my close colleague, has said very clearly in his wonderful book. And hence, an important aspect of any education discipline is its learned societies. Education's major learned societies are now only just 100 years old, as you can see from the slide there. The very start of the British Education Research Association was at a time when teacher training was being was actually being reassessed by government, including proposals for the integration in university departments of education. So to summarise this first section, education for me is a fundamental aspect of human existence that has a very long history indeed. Its formalisation in schools and then as an academic discipline in universities was to come much later, but the connection between these two histories is, I think, an essential part of understanding education as a specialised way of thinking. So now I move to the second section, just to outline some of the theoretical ideas that have underpinned my preparation for the talk and indeed the talk itself. Now, education has been described as having epistemological weaknesses. This is the discipline. And the weaknesses have been attributed to a lack of the consensus and indeed the coherence of some of the more established disciplines. John Furlong's excellent work said this: "As I said, using the term discipline to refer to the university-based study of education will be seen by some readers as inappropriate. The most common term used to characterise education is as a field. Because the study of education covers so many different educational contexts, and I highlight this bit, because it draws on so many other disciplinary perspectives, brackets from neuroscience to economics and philosophy, and because it's studied by using so many different approaches to research and scholarship, from history or literary studies to ethnography or randomized controlled trials, because of all of this, how can it be anything else but a field?" Furlong is being rhetorical here, by the way. "By definition, it must fail the first test of a discipline which demands some coherence, distinctiveness and rigour in terms of epistemology." And that is the main theme of my talk tonight. It goes on, "What's more, when compared to traditions of educational research in other countries, such as France and Germany, rather than being conceived as a science with a focus on theory and basic research, Furlong said that education in the UK is built on an enduring but unstable pragmatic compromise, a compromise between theory and practice, between knowing that and knowing how, in the commitment of the academy to both make an intellectual and a practical contribution to the advancement of the field." And more recently, theory depicting the origins of education in different countries has looked at the emergence of the discipline in relation to professional practice. So former President Jeff Whitty and indeed John Furlong in their edited book identified 3 main origins of education, and they put these in what they call clusters. So cluster 1 is the academic knowledge traditions. That's how it looks in their book. And these foreground academic knowledge, and we might be familiar with the idea of education having origins in philosophy, history, sociology and psychology, for example. Cluster 2 they describe as the practical knowledge traditions, based primarily on the world of practice. For example, they give this example of competencies and standards as one of these, and ideas that part of networked professional knowledge, they say. And the third cluster, integrated knowledge traditions. These are traditions that explicitly attempt to bring academic and practical knowledge into some kind of relationship with each other. Examples of these traditions include, and I quote, practitioner inquiry / action research. They acknowledge that the categorization has considerable overlaps and is a heuristic device. But nevertheless, for me, really interesting. I pursue that and use it in today's talk. Now, of course, one of the challenges of layering countries onto these clusters and types of knowledge traditions is that different knowledge traditions coexist in the history of development of education in any one country or region. And there are the ever-present difficulties of accurately summarizing traditions as objectively national while allowing for sufficient nuance in the categorizations. So, for example, in the UK, education in universities was initially strongly influenced by academic knowledge traditions through the so-called founding disciplines of psychology, philosophy, history and sociology, but at the same time, teacher training was also an influence, as the claim to epistemological weakness in education has attested. They give an example of an academic knowledge tradition, or they give an example of a country, should I say, Germany, where education in universities was established earlier than in many other parts of the world. And Whitty and Furlong suggest that, quote, German educational theory has been concerned with influencing the world of practice in a direct way. Its concerns historically have been primarily philosophical and ultimately moral, with most researchers focusing on what Stokes would characterize as pure basic research. However, for me, German educational theory can also be linked with an integrated knowledge tradition. The important concept of didactic has been fundamental to thinking in Germany since the emergence of public schooling in the 15th century. And Hudson has argued that didactic places the professionally autonomous teacher at the heart of the learning process and provides a frame for teachers to ask questions about their professional practice. And the roots of didactic in Germany lie not only in the origins of public schooling, but also in hermeneutics. So, didactic could perhaps be seen as related to two traditions of knowledge, academic knowledge traditions deriving from didactic's roots in German hermeneutics, but also practical knowledge traditions reflecting autonomous teachers making decisions in relation to curriculum derived from their selections of knowledge embedded in their conceptions or beliefs about education. So, to sum up this second section, a key consideration for educational researchers and for all with interest in education is the extent to which education is weak as an academic discipline in comparison with other disciplines. Thinking about the origins of education is important to me in relation to understanding it as a vital facet of human life and ultimately as a formal academic discipline in universities. So I now move to the third section where I want to compare education a bit more directly with obviously a selection of other disciplines. And I've chosen things like mathematics and natural sciences, which I hope you'll see why in a moment. And they're often seen, mathematics and natural science subjects are often seen as having greater consensus and coherence in education. The coherence is attributed to aspects such as strongly bounded areas of theory, a limited range of methodologies, clearly defined substantive research topics, and as a consequence, less influence from and fewer connections with other disciplines. Mathematics is usually regarded as one of the most coherent disciplines. However, multidisciplinary connections are rooted in the history of the development of mathematics. So during the Renaissance period, aesthetic thinking was an essential component of mathematical thinking and had its origins in pre-Socratic philosophy. For example, the influence of aesthetic thinking in relation to the beauty of architectural shape and structure, reflected in the golden ratio or the Fibonacci sequence. With regard to science and its history, aesthetics and artworks have been sources of inspiration and even conceptual tools used as part of, I quote, the natural interaction between arts, mathematics and science, practiced by the scientists, mathematicians and artists themselves. Aesthetic sensibility and other varied connections and influences can be seen in maths and science also through their world-leading discoveries, including in the dissemination and reception of these discoveries. So, for example, if we take a world-leading discovery in maths, this was initially rooted in a historical perspective, namely the philosophy of Pythagorean logic of geometry. This resulted in a problem being posed by the French mathematician Pierre de Fermat 300 years prior to its ultimate solution. The next two slides show the tantalizing remark written by Fermat. I will enlarge it. So here it was, it's in Latin. I have a truly marvellous demonstration of this proposition, which this margin is just too narrow to contain. And what was this proposition? That there is no whole number solution to x to the power n plus y to the power n equals z to the power n. In other words, although we can find solutions to Pythagoras' theorem x squared plus y squared equals z squared, it's not possible to solve the equation if n is a whole number greater than 2. The solving of Fermat's last theorem by the British mathematician Andrew Wiles resulted in Wiles winning a major international prize that had remained unclaimed for more than 300 years. Wiles had to bring together for the first time several previously unrelated major branches of mathematical thinking as part of his work. Of note is the narrative quality of Wiles's published mathematical proof, as you can, well, I hope you can just about see. So this is just one page from the proof that was finally published. And I was really struck by, you would think it would just all be symbols and equations. Well, it's much more than that. It's a narrative. And so aesthetic considerations, namely beauty and elegance, were clearly part of Andrew Wiles's understanding of mathematics. And this was seen in his reflections about the moment when he realised he'd finally solved the problem. And I quote, "So, out of the ashes of the Cully-Wagen flash," that's a mathematical model, "seemed to rise the true answer to the problem. It was so indescribably beautiful. It was so simple and so elegant. I couldn't understand how I'd missed it, and I just stared at it in disbelief for 20 minutes. And why do we know about this, and why do I know about this? Because the way that Wiles solved the problem became the subject of Simon Singh's wonderful book about the solving of the problem. So aesthetic considerations are important for maths and maths-related subjects. So if we take cosmology, I remember noting that a PhD student of the world-renowned physicist Stephen Hawking memorably explained in relation to the day-to-day work with mathematical equations, he said, part of the work is just a search for beauty and prettiness. An example of a world-leading discovery in science that shows multidisciplinary influences is the breakthrough called the Evolutionary Synthesis. This brought together Darwinian evolutionary theory with Mendelian genetics to definitively establish genetic variation as the mechanism for evolutionary change. The discovery was presented in the book Tempo and Mode in Evolution by Gaylord Simpson. And Journet has a really interesting take on this breakthrough. I quote, "In particular, narrative has been critical in helping philosophers, rhetoricians and scientists to differentiate what are sometimes called historical sciences from what are termed experimental, predictive or functional sciences. Specifically, historical sciences offer narrative accounts of the past. They do so not simply by describing the past, but by selecting and organising events deemed to be significant into chronological and causal sequence, and by endowing them with such qualities as coherence, direction and closure. The resulting historical narrative thus interprets the chaos of the past and provides it with meaning." So the important point here for me is that even in the so-called hard or natural sciences, other disciplinary factors are part of the identification of research problems and their solutions. And in an epistemological debate that's familiar in education, Journet noted that historical sciences work against the grain of what many see as the hegemony of hypothesis, prediction, experiment. This process of, quote, looking backward to the past to establish causal relations and infer patterns is done through the construction of narrative argument. So I've argued so far that influences on academic disciplines include a range of societal influences, including professional practices, and the influence of multiple disciplines and ways of thinking. Another way to analyse the nature of academic disciplines is through a more focused consideration of the types of research that are carried out. The Frascati definition has been used to define research in assessments of research across whole countries and other large regions. And I'll just quote from it now. The term research and development covers three types of activity: basic research, applied research, and experimental development. Basic research is experimental or theoretical work undertaken primarily to acquire new knowledge of the underlying foundations of phenomena and observable facts without any particular application or use in view. Applied research is original investigation undertaken in order to acquire new knowledge. It is, however, directed primarily towards a specific practical aim or objective. Experimental development is systematic work drawing on knowledge gained from research and practical experience and producing additional knowledge which is directed to produce new products or processes or to improving existing products or processes. So, of note, for me, in the Frascati definition, is the straightforward acceptance that applied research can be original investigation. Rather than see educational research rooted in practical problems as a weakness, it could be more appropriate to describe such research as applied research. And large-scale assessments of research provide evidence not only of research quality, but also the nature of disciplines. In 2014, the UK's Research Excellence Framework, known as REF, and previously was called the Research Assessment Exercise, allocated academic disciplines to different panels. Panel C included education as fitting the inclusion criteria that specified disciplines do not have firm or rigidly definable boundaries, and that aspects of research are naturally interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, or span the boundaries between individual units of assessment. And the REF descriptor for education research clearly showed education's multidisciplinary character. Again, I quote from it: "Research in education is multidisciplinary and is closely related to a range of other disciplines with which it shares common interests, methods, and approaches." And this characteristic was shared by 11 units of assessment in Panel C, including law, one of the oldest subjects, as I've described, sociology, economics, and econometrics. An education in the REF 2014 report was described as consisting of work in 4 areas. 1 was sectors of education provision, 2 was substantive issues, 3 was theoretical frameworks and methodologies drawn from disciplinary traditions, and 4 was other related fields of activity, such as pedagogy in higher education. And although multidisciplinarity was a characteristic of all the disciplines in Panel C, the division of education into the 4 areas marked it as atypical when compared to other disciplines. The comparison I made earlier in this talk between education and maths and science can be augmented now then by consideration of the information available as a result of the REF. Perhaps the discipline with a REF descriptor showing the strongest contrast to education was physics, and this was one of the areas in the Panel B group of subjects. As you can see in the slide, it has a long list of topics that are researched by physicists. And the expectation of the subpanel was that physics research would have made a direct contribution to the discipline in the areas listed in the slide, and it was acknowledged that the list was not finite. As can be seen, the idea that research can be theoretical as well as empirical is part of the characterization of the discipline of physics. And the short entry, which was the descriptor for physics, briefly acknowledged the increasingly interdisciplinary nature of research. Now take the REF descriptor for mathematical sciences, and by the way, of course, the title itself clearly signals a multidisciplinary connection. This one was as succinct as the one for physics. However, the interdisciplinary character of mathematics was explicitly recognized in several ways. First and foremost was the recognition that mathematics, statistics, and operational research includes the application of these 3 aspects in, I quote, the study of biological, physical, and social sciences, commerce, engineering, finance, government, health, industry, information science, medicine, and elsewhere. The specified areas of mathematical science research included more than 35 topics, and acknowledged that the list was necessarily incomplete. And you will recall that the argument about weakness in education as a discipline includes the high number of topics of research. In recognition of interdisciplinary research, it was expected that outputs on, quote, the history of mathematical scientists would be received and therefore evaluated. Further evidence for me that the historical sciences mentioned earlier in the talk have a recognised place in the discipline of mathematics. And outputs in mathematical sciences describing what was called purely pedagogical research were to be referred to the education subpanel. Now, it's worth noting that in these two well-established and coherent disciplines, mathematical sciences and physics, there is a lack of consistency in the placing of what the rest call pedagogic or pedagogical research. Whereas pedagogic research in physics was to be included in the REF assessment for mathematical sciences, pedagogical research was referred to the education subpanel. The allocation of pedagogic research in different disciplines in the REF, by which they mean research that addresses teaching and learning in higher education, is, I think, another important aspect of understanding the potential contribution of the discipline of education and its research. Finally, for the REF examples, another science discipline relevant to my consideration of research and practice was life sciences, and in particular clinical medicine. It's interesting to compare the ways in which the place of professional practice in relation to research is summarised in clinical medicine research compared to education research. Contrary to some downbeat appraisals of the influence of professional practice on education research, the REF 2014 report from clinical medicine was more positive about aspects of such links. In the UK, medical practitioners work mainly in the National Health Service, and the REF subpanel found this: the beneficial effects of the increasingly close working relationship between UK academia and the NHS, almost certainly enhanced by the National Institute for Health Research funding awarded to the NHS partners. From identifying research problems, producing high-quality research, to ensuring that this research is translated into bedside care, the unique partnership working between academia and the NHS in the UK clearly underpins a significant proportion of the excellence the subpanel found in the submissions. And perhaps of relevance when comparing the issue of large numbers of university staff in education departments who previously would not be eligible for submission to the REF because of their work being largely dominated by teacher training, the panel for medicine found that while outputs from basic science-led teams were well represented at the highest level, fewer were received from the scientifically trained investigator clinician. The subpanel identified that fostering and maintaining a cadre of such individuals equipped to deliver experimental medicine studies in their clinical disciplines was important for the future UK biomedical vitality. Now, it seems to me it may be that education research could learn from the beneficial effects of the close working relationship between academia and the professionals working for the NHS found in clinical medicine. And in addition, the importance of fostering scientifically trained investigator clinicians in such research may have a parallel with the need to continue to engage teacher training staff in university departments with education research. I'm not, by the way, suggesting they don't. I'm just emphasising how important it is. Very briefly then, just to take one other nation-state survey of research, I've selected the Australia and New Zealand picture and the State of Australian University Research Report in particular, because it based its categories of academic disciplines on guidelines established by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2008. Unlike the UK's REF, the Australian, quote, Division 13 Education, I'm afraid the titles are nearly always not terribly memorable, explicitly excluded sociology of education, educational psychology, educational linguistics, and history and philosophy of education. And Division 13 Education in the Australian report consisted of 4 groups, which I've reproduced here. So you can see education systems is a focus for research, curriculum and pedagogy, specialist studies, and then this category, other education, is only for education research that's not classified in the other 3 groups. That does not mean the founding discipline, the research in the founding disciplines, which, as I said, was excluded. And across the 4 groups that education research is organised into in Australia, it can be seen by reading the report that a focus on teaching and learning is applicable to all 4 groups. The structure of the Australian categorisation perhaps gives a more coherent picture of education than we have in the REF. And the focus on 4 groups of research in the Australian report is perhaps more consistent with the REF's presentation of common topics in physics research and other sciences and mathematics. However, a caveat to this is the emphasis of the Australian State of Research report is on presentation of statistics of research performance and is somewhat limited by its minimal narrative commentary, which could have given us an even more useful interpretation of the state of and nature of the disciplines in education and so on. So, to sum up the 3rd section of my talk, I am arguing that a historical understanding of disciplines and their development and the analysis of research assessments at nation-state level shows us that multidisciplinary thinking has been the norm. And as Barry and Bourne noted, I quote, "It's not as if in the past knowledge production took place in autonomous and unified disciplines and that it no longer does so." However, there are trends recently where we see structural changes, for example, in research funding opportunities, to reinforce the importance of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity in relation to the solving of previously intractable problems, grand challenges as these are being called. My 4th section then is now very much about educational practice and research and some of the links between them. So you'll recall that another of the arguments about the alleged weakness of education as a discipline is the attention to educational practice as part of its research. There are, of course, issues in relation to the quality of research in all disciplines, and it's true that in education, the issues of quality of research and attention to education practice are a consideration. The REF Education panel noted that, quote, "some studies," and I'll just underline this, close to practice, lacked originality, significance and rigour. And, quote, "less strong research in the submission was often the small-scale professional research or action research, which was frequently insufficiently theorised to make a contribution to knowledge and or was low in rigour, with poor use of statistical data or inappropriately selective reporting of qualitative data." The BERA Close to Practice research project was inspired in part by that kind of very important observation. And myself and a team of us won the tender to investigate this, and we were looking at the nature of education research that's close to practice and the aspects of the quality of some of that research. The research consisted of a rapid evidence assessment, and in that we initially identified a range of traditions of close to practice research, including practitioner inquiry and action research. These 2 traditions were linked with the highest numbers of research outputs that we found in the systematic processes of the REA. Practitioner inquiry was the more diverse tradition, and in the UK, the most well-known example of practitioner inquiry was perhaps the teacher as researcher movement typified by the work of Lawrence Stenhouse and John Eliot. However, other trends, such as those related to work on the social construction of knowledge, were also part of practitioner inquiry in the UK, as Rosemary Webb's account, written in 1990, her book in 1990, showed. In the USA, diversity also characterised practitioner inquiry, noted in various trends. So, for example, teacher research in teacher education was one of these trends of focus, the development of theories of teacher research, the development of critiques of teacher research, and the potential of teacher research to influence some aspects of university culture. And I was very happy to find, or be reminded of one of our keynote speakers, Marilyn Cochrane-Smith's paper with her colleague, and also actually some of the remarks that Pat Thompson made earlier, very much touching on some of these issues. However, I want to make a distinction between practitioner inquiry and action research, Because for me, action research has a longer tradition, dating back in particular to a paper by Kurt Lewin in 1946. And the main focus of Lewin's work was how groups interact, in particular the interactions of minority and majority groups, or intergroup relations, the subject of his 1946 paper, the first page of which you can see on the slide, or, well, hopefully can see on the slide. Now, in view of the many different interpretations of action research, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of some of Lewin's ideas from the time. The key quotation where the phrase action research is first used by Lewin is this one. The research needed for social practice can best be characterized as research for social management or social engineering. It is a type of action research, a comparative research on the conditions and effects of various forms of social action and research leading to social action. Now, Lewin made the point that action research does not need to be any less scientific than, quotes, pure science in the field of social events. He made reference to another discipline rooted in practice, namely engineering. He argued that these kind of disciplines had turned more to basic research, but this was predating the more recent claims that education has not moved sufficiently towards basic research. And rather than see action research as somehow separate from social science because of its use in close-to-practice research, Lewin saw action research as an ideal methodology to address intergroup relations, a concern that remains fundamental to education and society today. And he said, in regard to social engineering too, progress will depend largely on the rate with which basic research in social sciences can develop deeper insight into the laws which govern social life. This, quotes, basic social research will have to include mathematical and conceptual problems of theoretical analysis. It'll have to include the whole range of descriptive fact-finding in regard to small and large social bodies. Above all, it'll have to include laboratory and field experiments in social change. So our rapid evidence assessment in the Close to Practice project identified a majority of papers that had used action research methodologies as part of research that we defined as close to practice. And the final section of close to practice studies, the final selection of the studies in this rapid evidence assessment found that the best close to practice research addressed research problems that were rooted in the practical realities of education, including policy, was well theorized, methodologically rigorous, and disseminated in a way that ensured significant impact, even if relatively small scale. We also carried out interviews with people who had expertise in the issues of quality in close-to-practice research, these interviewees noted both the merits of such research, but also the challenges. And they identified the REF as a particular challenge. So a number of respondents expressed views about the distinction between researcher and practitioner activities, arguing for a more collaborative and horizontal partnership in which both partners contribute relevant knowledge. For example, the pseudonym here, I'm calling her Val. I'm particularly interested in how knowledge is created and translated within different communities. And my view is that actually they're both practice communities, in fact. So the idea is that one is research and one isn't research is misleading. They're different practices which intersect. And if I return now to the three clusters of knowledge traditions, I don't think action research is quite synonymous with practitioner inquiry, because I see action research as an influential methodology, particularly in education research, and was adopted widely by many university-based educationalists in the UK because of its perceived relevance to research problems rooted in practice. However, its disciplinary roots, such that they are, come from research on productivity in factories as a result of democratic participation by workers. As a result, action research and practitioner inquiry could be categorized as part of the practical knowledge traditions, that cluster. So, to sum this bit up, the need to address problems in practice, I would say, is common to many disciplines. Attention to practice is not in itself a reason for weakness in a discipline. Research is judged as relatively higher or lower quality by the criteria of the discipline, and some of these criteria are more universal than others. The need to make an original contribution to knowledge requires research that is carried out in a methodologically robust way and that it's deemed to be significant. These characteristics, it seems to me, are true of research in any discipline, whether that research is close to practice or not. And so that brings me to the final section of my talk, which I'm calling Education and its Contribution to Knowledge Now and in the Future. I hope I've been able to show and demonstrate and convince that language and its use in the pedagogy of education is a defining feature of humans. Historically, this pedagogy represented the first education. It was an education rooted in practical problems to be solved. Much later in human history, but way before the establishment of education as academic discipline in universities, ways of thinking about education became formalized in writing. In contrast to this long history, it's also the case that education as a formal academic discipline in universities and in organizations like BERA has a short history. But throughout the history of thinking about education, attention to practice has, in my view, been central to theory and research. Contrary to the perception that closeness to practice is part of an epistemological weakness, it is in fact one of the great strengths of most educational thinking and research. The continuing powerful influence of educational thinking outside the academy can now be seen in new forms of influence, such as through social media and developments, dare I say it, such as research ed. These developments show the need for education researchers to work closely with practitioners. It remains pressing, not least to contribute to the rigour and balance of some of the evidence claims. And the practice of education policy at national level, for example, in the increasing control of curriculum and pedagogy in early years and primary school settings, or at international level in the increasing influence of league tables of secondary age pupil performance, continues to require education research for more enlightened understanding. So, on the slide you can see a range of elements that we probably, well, hopefully would agree are part of knowledge in education. It seems to me their positions are relative rather than categorical. So, for example, action research and teacher training are embedded in both practical and academic knowledge. And the relativity of positioning comes to the fore when I reapply the continuum to a single element by adding a second layer. And one could go to further layers because you could apply any one of these concepts to a third layer to further analyse practical and academic knowledge elements. Assessments of research quality reveal that education is not the only discipline with multiple influences and connections. Rather than see education's history of disciplinary connections as representative of a lack of cohesion, we should more confidently equate such multidisciplinarity with more well-established disciplines. With the renewed emphasis on multi- and interdisciplinarity in relation to the world's grand challenges, education researchers are well placed to contribute as a result of familiarity with working in interdisciplinary ways. The researching of pedagogy is one of the many opportunities for education researchers to continue to make vital multidisciplinary contributions to knowledge. So, the idea that the link with practice represents a weakness in education as a discipline should now surely be dispelled. Of course, there are examples of research that is not as original, robust, or significant as other research, both in education and in other disciplines. But this is consistent with variations in quality in all human endeavours. My argument is not that there aren't areas of improvement for education research. Benchmarking against comparable disciplines can be helpful, but this benchmarking must be done taking full account of histories of thinking and the establishment of key institutions. A more confident, outward-facing attitude is needed in the representation and portrayal of education research, including for research organisations such as BERA. Part of this renewed confidence should include further engagement with the opportunities that multidisciplinarity presents. And it also requires determination to communicate more effectively the benefits to society of educational research, underpinned by its close connection with and understanding of education practice. Certainly, important advances in thinking continue to be made from the founding subjects of education. For example, psychologically oriented work on the dialogue of classrooms, such as that done by Neil Mercer, or from philosophy we might cite Geert Biester's account of the risk of education. Education research is also sometimes framed by more specific theoretical ideas derived from other disciplinary perspectives, for example, Margaret Archer's theories of agency. And education research can also draw in a multidisciplinary way from a range of disciplinary bases to inform thinking, as I've done in my work on writing and indeed in today's talk. The multidisciplinary orientation of some education research has similarities with the way that, for example, Lev Vygotsky's frames of reference had the breadth that in the end contributed to his status in relation to socio-cultural theory, which has come to be one of the dominant ways of thinking in education and social sciences. The introduction to Vygotsky's book Thought and Language summarised the importance of multidisciplinarity to Vygotsky's approach to research, and I quote from that introduction. Vygotsky argued that psychology cannot limit itself to direct evidence, be it observable behaviour or accounts of introspection. The psychologist must take into account individual evidence and circumstantial clues, which in practice means that works of art, philosophical arguments, and anthropological data are no less important for psychology than direct evidence. For me, the evidence suggests from major surveys of research activity, from scholarship about education as a discipline, and from consideration of individual research studies, that the use of multiple theories, methodologies and methods is an important part of the way that education knowledge has developed and will continue to develop in future. It was argued by another BERA past president, John Gardner, that a defining characteristic of research that typifies the discipline of education is a focus on learning. The review of research and theory in my talk suggests the addition of teaching to learning, or even more appropriate, the concept of pedagogy could be a defining characteristic of education and another way to argue for coherence in the discipline. Research studies that focus explicitly on learning and teaching are, of course, a very large part of education research, for example, in experimental trials and qualitative analyses of teaching interventions. And even in education research where the focus on pedagogy is less explicit, there are often important implications for pedagogy. For example, statistical analyses of international comparisons of education systems raise key questions about the effectiveness of curricula in relation to pupils' progress as a result of the pedagogy they encounter. In sociological studies of social disadvantage, the implications of contesting what is seen as neoliberal hegemony is connected to the improvement of education policies to enhance equity in learning for children from disadvantaged backgrounds compared with peers from more advantaged backgrounds. And finally, most of all, education research in diverse topics using a wide range of methods, influenced by a multitude of theories, is seeking to find ways that inequalities in learning, or we might say intergroup learning, can be addressed through appropriate teaching. As the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations explicitly recognise, education is a foundation for societal advancement within which teaching and learning, research and theory are fundamental to the progress of nations and their communities right across the world. The multiple emphases of education are given coherence through attention to pedagogy. This is the case historically, as evidence in education debates in society, and is the case in the universities of the 21st century. Thank you very much.